turn off my aircon. All right, good morning. Starting a couple minutes late here, but hope everybody's having an amazing morning so far, or afternoon, depending on where you are. So welcome to Products with Purpose. My name is Eli Harrell, and I'm a lifelong entrepreneur, advocate of self-directed learning, lifelong self-directed learning, if I could speak. Huge supporter of purpose-driven business. And the purpose of this interview series called Products with Purpose is to tell the stories of extraordinary people who are putting everything on the line, going all in to create real impact. People who are building products and businesses that are meant to sustainably change the way we live and the way we see the role of business on the planet. And as anybody who has ever been an entrepreneur would know, when you go all in like that, failure can really be disheartening. So the goal that I have with this show is just to increase the odds any way that we can of success by sharing stories of people who are in a similar vital game. So I am very pleased to have as a guest this morning Vijay Solanki, who is the founder of ParentalEQ. And I think you're going to enjoy listening to him talk about his story. He's somebody who has come from a mixture of cultures, was born in, I believe it was Kenya, is that correct? Yes. To Indian parents, but then grew up in the UK, now lives in Australia. He has a background in psychology, but also in marketing. He led marketing teams and built products with very large multinational companies before transitioning into being an entrepreneur. So I think it's very fascinating because he considered himself an entrepreneur, somebody who used to innovate inside large companies, but now he's solving problems from scratch. So without further ado, please welcome and thank you for being here, Vijay.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so this is our second shot at this because we had connection problems last time. So let's see how much fun we can have the second time around. I guess just to get started in letting people know a little bit about you, tell us about the journey that led you from being a corporate entrepreneur to now starting something from nothing in ParentalEQ.
Yeah, look, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's good to be here. Good to see you again, Eli. I enjoyed large corporations. I think most of the time I was doing stuff that was at least interesting. Sometimes there was some purpose associated with it. There was certainly a great deal of satisfaction. One of the upsides of a corporation is that you can leverage the capabilities of the organization, the brand, the resources. It's much easier if you can get alignment and agreement to have a big impact. And I was able to do that from launching new products to relaunching products to launching digital services. So from Unilever to Philips and with Shazam in the middle. For me, it was a pretty fundamental thing that happens to all of us at some point, which is the loss of one of my parents. It was the loss of my mother 3 years ago. My father had passed a couple of years before then. And whilst I'd been someone who'd left home quite young, had been taught by my father to be independent, the loss of my mother floored me, impacted my own mental health for a while, which had never happened before. And it got me thinking about the role of parents. One of the piece of advice my mother gave me, which I'd probably ignored at the time when I was a first-time parent, was the importance of really dedicating yourself to parenting. It's not a passive thing, something that both parents need to do. And I don't think I'd done that. So when mum went, it was mental health and parenting. And that's really at the heart of ParentalEQ. That was the beginning of that journey.
Thank you for sharing the journey that led you where you are. And so I guess tell us a little bit more about how that experience of losing your mom and the realizations that you had, like how did that lead into ParentalEQ, and maybe tell us a little bit about what are the problems that you're trying to solve with building this product.
So those two triggers, I was part of a startup accelerator here in Sydney called Antler. I'd also moved out of corporate and started doing a few things: consulting, investing in startups, and coaching startups. And I felt that I had a lot of permission to go and coach startups because I'd worked at Shazam. But it wasn't until I started working with founders who'd built something from nothing that I realized that is very hard and very different. And I felt like a bit of a fraud. And that was actually one of the reasons I stepped into a startup accelerator. It just so happened in that first week, I bumped into a guy who's one of my co-founders, who's got a strong clinical research and digital health background. And at Antler, I describe it as speed dating meets founders. And we were in this workshop in the first week, looking at children's mental health because it was something, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that piqued my interest. And there was a data point, which is that 50% of mental health issues start before the age of 14, but most go unnoticed and therefore undiagnosed. And that really struck a chord with me. That is still the first data point that's on the second slide of our pitch deck, because we were in a world where mental health has opened up. We talk about it, but actually we don't really understand as parents and as average grown-ups what's going on. And as we started to go deeper, we realized that parents and carers are the most important role models in a child life, particularly up from obviously from 0 to 3, but from 3 to 14 until they go into adolescence. So that got us thinking about the role of parents when it comes to emotional well-being and mental health. And we boiled it down to two fundamental challenges that modern day parents have. One, as I've mentioned, we don't understand mental health. By that, what I mean is we don't really understand the relationship between a child's brain, their behaviors, and their emotions. And it's funny, the smartest of us, we might think about that when we're talking to our children, but not really. And certainly when we're under pressure, we can find ourselves reverting to type and getting bloody frustrated because why are you doing what I'm telling you? And so there's a whole opportunity and requirement to help parents take a step back. And then secondly, we went deeper and by this point had interviewed hundreds of parents. And we realized that when you're looking for support in the mental health space, it's really difficult. There's a lot of friction there. So they're the two things that we're out to solve.
That's a fascinating topic. All of us have gone through, all of us who are now adults have gone through whatever childhood we went through, with whether we had parents or we had the caregivers, as you're saying. Um, I would imagine almost all of us have memories that are good and then some that are not so good that we didn't understand, and this is where traumas come from. And I know I've had a lot of things in my past where I needed to kind of work through and figure out issues that I had that I think were quite related to experiences growing up, where I grew up in a family with 8 kids. I was the oldest, and my mom was also running a business, and it was really chaotic. And I remember I have vivid memories of experiences that were really hard to understand as a kid that I think, could have shaped me in a worse direction. Fortunately, I think I responded to them pretty well, but some kids, and I think some of my siblings, didn't. And of course, then you become a parent, right? And then you don't want to ever yell at your kids. You don't ever want to make them feel like you don't love them. So this is a very fascinating area, because it really does shape how we become as adults. And so thinking about what you're saying about realizing that it's before the age of 14 that most mental health issues are really starting to be created, right? Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Sounds like a very important conversation that really hasn't been happening that I know of. I mean, I'm sure it's somewhere somebody's trying to solve similar problems, but I don't know if it's happening at scale yet. So I think that's a really important thing you've chosen to solve. So thank you for that. Tell us a little bit about how you're going about it. Like, what have you done so far to create something that attempts to solve this problem, and what kind of What kind of progress have you made?
Yeah, we've been on the journey for over 18 months, and we started by when we were still part of the accelerator, researching and building prototypes. And by May of last year, so May 2020, when this thing called COVID came along and was starting to change our worlds, we built our first prototype, and that was focused on worries, fears, and anxiety. It was just a handful of modules delivered through a mobile app that we could give to parents to try and help them understand what is going on in a child's mind when it comes to anxiety. And at the same time, we had started spending time with clinical and academic psychologists to build what are now called activities. So we'd started this idea that you can take the sort of activities that a therapist would use in a practice room. You could take them out of the practice room, simplify them, shorten them, and put them in the hands of a parent. The mission, which was something we defined quite early on, and I think remains our North Star, is that this world of psychology doesn't have to belong just to the psychologists. It can be simplified. It can be democratized. It's just that, who wants to read a book on it? And even though there are some great books on it, they're hard to apply. Even all the great information you can find through Google is hard to apply. So the mission remains pretty clear, and the journey is around how you fit all of this into the lives of a busy working parent. So we raised a little bit of money, and at the beginning of this year built our kind of first sort of fully rounded MVP, if you like, focusing on behaviors, emotions, families that have had need support with a diagnosis like ADHD, parenting skills, and also parenting support. I mean, parenting, we often forget ourselves, and that metaphor that when you're on a plane and there's trouble, you put on your own mask before the mask of the child. You've got to be fit and ready as a parent. So we've built out those modules. We started off it being a pure play mobile app with 2 tracks, what we call knowledge, where we're shortening and simplifying and explaining key topics. So, for example, here's a 5-minute audio on the science of anxiety. We're not trying to make you into a psychologist. We're not trying to educate you. We're simply trying to give you some context, to really give you the context, to really give you the confidence to then go and do an activity on, let's say, anxiety. We started doing that, and by this time there were probably 30, 40 modules in the product. And it was as if we'd built a gym. My metaphor is we've built this great gym. And of course, for anyone who likes any form of exercise, gyms can be wonderful. But when you go into a new one, you're often looking around going, where the hell do I start?
Yeah.
And that was one of our big realizations. We're doing analytical research into the app and the behavioral patterns in the app. And at the same time, every few weeks, we're interviewing parents. So we were starting to uncover that parents were getting stuck. And I think it's important that certainly the version of the service we've got now, it's hard to be accountable to a piece of software. It's much easier to be accountable to a human-to-human interaction like the one that we're having. So a couple of months ago, we added a counselor into the app, a parent expert, so a psychology graduate with a counseling diploma with some other parenting diplomas under their belt. You download the app, you go through, you create a little profile, you tell us what you want to focus on. Parents tell us they really like that, feels like they're feeling some empathy. And then we push you into a session with an expert. Over 15, 20 minutes, you tell us what you want to focus on, to think of it as analogous to a physical instructor before you go into a gym. You then get a program. And then that program curates the modules in the app that are relevant for you. And then you can start to make progress on whatever topic you're dealing with, if it's anxiety, if it's anger, if it's a socialization issue. And then we've learned that probably the last thing to say is we were hoping that, because we interviewed hundreds and hundreds of parents, that every parent you ask, how important is emotional well-being, and which parent is going to say no? Of course, no one said no. When we built that first prototype and charged the price of a cup of coffee, $4.49, we found more than half of parents were like, no, we're good. As soon as you put a price tag. And what we've uncovered is the reality is, in the busy, pressured world of most parents do not take action today until there's a perceived problem in the room. So where we are going harder today is really homing in on those who need help today. And they fall into broadly two camps. Parents that are going through big situational change, could be moving city, could be moving school. Separation is the big obvious one, where there is a lot of turmoil often, and certainly a lot of guilt, and a big interest around child emotional health. And then the second one, which has been significantly compounded because of COVID, is therapist waiting time. So that's that. So we're an app that can be downloaded and used by any parent, but we're also trying to build something that's commercially viable. So those two groups are the parents that we believe are the ones that are prepared to pay and need our help right now.
Fascinating. Thank you. That's a lot of context that I think would be helpful for other people out there that are building products with purpose, that listening to the way you've gone through what you're learning and the way you're iterating, that I think that's very useful to share those details. Speaking of that, I would love to key in on the specific topic that you referenced a few times. There is, like, I know I've heard you talk about how obsessed you are with getting market feedback, which I think is beautiful, because it's something that I talk a lot about. Is we've noticed across all the customers that we work with and the companies that are building products, the biggest single success differentiator is the systems they use and the process and the habits they have of getting customer feedback coming in, and then prioritizing their product decisions based on that. So can you talk a little bit about, I presume that this obsession comes from your background in the corporations where you were being an entrepreneur, yes? But to talk a little bit about, like, how did you get this mindset, and what are your philosophies or principles that you use to make sure you're really making your decisions based on customer feedback and or challenges?
Yeah, I think so let me start with mindset. It can be inherent. I've got a feeling my late mother would often describe me as being a bit too nosy. I think she was too. I think I get it from her. So I think some of it was inherent, that I'm like, why? And then you can argue, is it chicken or is it egg? But i.e., that was then compounded by studying psychology. But did I study psychology because I had a natural interest in consumer or people behavior? Who knows? That gave me some philosophies around why, right back from Freud and Jung, but more usefully, it gave me some tools and techniques. And I think that what modern psychology is all about, its empirical nature. So it's about hypothesizing, running experiments, and it's been fascinating learning that in the late 80s, early 90s, and then seeing what was the bastion of science become the operating model of software-driven products. It's just, when you think about it, that's where it came from, right? This notion of, and then I think I got the opportunity in corporations to learn, and particularly my time at Philips, we had the resources to go and spend time with Eric Ries, and after he'd written Lean Startup, we could get Osterwalder into a room and explain a business model canvas. And I think we did some interviews with Steve Blank, and it was fascinating. I read an article this morning about don't try and suggest that intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship are the same. They're not. And I agree with that. They're not, because intrapreneurship it's a different set of kind of politics and context. But one of the things we were trying to do at Philips was to take components from the startup world and try and bring them into the corporate world. And we got a few things right, and we got a lot of things wrong. But those three names in particular Reith, Osterwalder, and Blank kind of stay with me. One in terms of agility and iteration, two in terms of how to kind of document the whole of the Osterwalder work and pains and gains and the business model canvas, and then Steve Blank just kind of, I think one of the problems that corporations have is reliant on traditional research methodologies, and probably it's part passion and part psychotic behavior that spurns an entrepreneur to actually go out and annoy people, because to some extent you have to get in front of people, and sometimes you have to get in their faces, and in corporations, like you don't need to really, you can avoid all of that. I kind of feel that hustle nature, it's fascinating because people in startups, and it's been funny doing it, having read about it and workshopped it in my corporate days, often think of hustle as getting the deal, persuading an investor, landing that first big partnership. But I think there's a hustle around insight, like kind of not giving up and asking the next why. And you can tell when the person you're talking to is getting a bit annoyed. And then there's an art and a science around how you can keep going. And then I think the final thing to say, which I learned the hard way, because I think startup, you're so limited with the resources that you have, and it's highly frustrating around the amount of ground you can cover, is the ability to operationalize that insight is easier said than done. I can come back every day, and I do, much to the annoyance of my co-founders, with new insights. But it's trying to figure out, and I don't know the answer to this, we're on our own journey around the process and the cadence by which you can turn what you've learned this week, this month, into product or into a test. That I think it depends on the nature of the team, the market that you're in, the type of product that you're doing, the resources, the amount of money you've got. But I think the heart of it is I don't know, for us, it's probably being able to do some tests and ask some more questions in a month, but usually needing 4 to 8 weeks to truly operationalize it as a meaningful feature. Not always, depends. I mean, if it's a massive pivot, well, then that could take a few months. If it's right, we think if we added this little timer button, we could get people to stay with us for longer. So I think that's the crux, operationalizing the insight.
That's beautiful. That's actually something we're working on right now in the accelerator that we're building, is to have a library of processes that we can help our clients install to make sure that they've got this very smoothly running cadence and process of taking that customer feedback and prioritizing it, making sure they've got a product owner that has that owns that process, right? And a lot of times we find that companies don't have these things set up that well. But this presumes that you've got the market feedback coming in the first place before you can process anything. I have a question connected to that. Have you run into challenges, and maybe not, maybe you have your partnership set up where this works well for you, but a lot of founders that I've seen, as they start to get some traction, run into a challenge where they tend to get sucked into the product development management itself, whether that's the tech team or just managing a team, and it pulls them away from that engagement with the customer. But it sounds like you've really stayed, like that's your passion, is to stay connected to the customer. Have you found a kind of a tug of war there for yourself?
I think there is a tug, because I think it's harder in a startup, for all the obvious reasons, than in a corporation, to know when to let go. And sometimes it can be trickier to empower a colleague. So I think that becomes hard. I mean, I'm lucky in that I've got two very smart and also very patient co-founders, and we've gone through our ups and downs of finding a cadence and an operating rhythm, and me being able to read the signals of Vijay, back off, go and do your thing for a couple of weeks. We've got this. and other times where it's like, hey, we've got this. Come and tell us what you see. And certainly Francisco, because of his strong clinical research background, has got fantastic rigor and methodology around how he collates and processes customer feedback. Whereas I think, and therefore, I would say is essentially more scientific about it than I am. I'm probably the one that's talking to more parents because it's the nature of what I do. And even when I'm pitching for money or pitching for a partnership, they're invariably parents, and so they want to talk about that. I have to be careful and considerate on how I bring that feedback back into the business, even as a startup with three. There's a risk of well, there's just three of us. I'll just share it. But actually, it is important to give consideration to the processes that work for you in your startup, that is respectful of the other people that you're working with. I often, whilst I think Jobs was a legend, I often, in fact, all the time, do not think he is the role model for how you collaborate. He got away with it because it was him. And I think that's super, super important, because I do worry about how founders are stereotyped, and that whole kind of, you got to hustle, you got to push, and you got to just be considered and smart about how you do it. So I think having those processes right and agreeing them with your co-founders is key, and playing around, experimenting with them.
Very much agree. I've learned very slowly some of those lessons, like trust your team. People need coaching, they need support, but they also need trust, and they need to be able to feel ownership in what they're doing. And I know I've come in and micromanaged and disrupted far too fast and often before to let them really learn and grow. Great stuff. Thank you for sharing. Just circling back a little bit to the specific problem that you're solving, I wanted to ask you, kind of related to the challenge that you have in helping parents know more. I guess it sounds like because of going to the oxygen mask on yourself before putting it on someone else metaphor. Really, it's what we all need is to understand ourselves better. And then I wish, if I could wish for anything, if I could go back and ask my parents to change anything, which I wouldn't actually do, but it would be keep focusing on growing yourself, because then I can keep learning from you. And that's the one thing I've tried to take to heart for my kids. Is like, if I could give them any gift, it would be to just grow myself and to be more peaceful, happier, know how to engage with a better, live life better. And then it'll just be easier to parent. I don't have to solve them. I have to solve me, which is a crazy difficult thing for you to approach. But yeah, I have a question specifically, but let you talk first, and then I'll ask it.
I know. I was just going to say that's super genius of you, and it's very profound. I've learned that through building this startup. It has profoundly changed the way I think about parenting, and I hope, although you'd have to ask the users how I parent. I make a joke, which is I still fuck it up, but at least I know I'm fucking it up, or I do shortly after. Excuse my French, but it is quite a profound thing to say, and I think. So I've had a personal experience as a parent building a parenting mental health startup. And if only more parents thought exactly like you just described there, Eli, I had not truly appreciated how much I role model. And most of the role model occurs when you're not conscious to it.
So true.
And you just have to let that sink in for a second. It's like, it's all, it's like when you're zen like, and you're in it, and you're in control, and you have those days where you feel quite magical, and you're like, I'm ready to influence. It is the time when you've lost it, you're under pressure, you're reverting to type and parenting like the way you said you never would because your parents did that, but you're under so much pressure. That's when, and it's just, look, doesn't mean that you can stop all of that happening, but that degree of self-awareness. The challenge we've got is 5% of parents would respond to that message if we positioned our service explicitly that way. The reality for us, because you're a startup, and particularly in Australia, if you're looking for investment, people want to see revenue-based traction. Well, people want problems to solve. And that's what people do. People are prepared, parents are prepared to pay for a meaningful problem that's hurting them.
Yeah.
Somebody put it beautifully to me just the other day, which is, as parents, we often walk with a pebble in our shoe. It's a bit uncomfortable, but we just carry on. And we kind of know we should do something about it, but we just don't. It's when it causes a cut in the foot, then you're like, oh, there's blood. You're like, if I'd taken it out, then there'd never been the blood. But it just does not. Human nature at the moment. I have hope, because I think 5 or 10 years ago, nobody really talked about mindfulness and meditation. It was something that Buddhists and hippies did, and now it's particularly driven by apps like Calm and Headspace, has been brought into the mainstream. I am confident that this small but growing wave, and COVID has helped it, will mean that mental health and parent self-awareness and knowledge around mental health will just continue to grow as a thing, in the same way that mindfulness has grown over the last 10 years. That is my hope. But like I say, the balance of building a successful startup is, what's the problem someone's going to pay you for today? So it's interesting trying to navigate the short term whilst not losing the North Star of the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like any, yeah, any product or solution that we ever build, we have to start, even if there's a ton of education that needs to be done, you can't start with that. You've got to start with the thing that brings people in, which is the pain that they already recognize, right? Um, do you think, because I'm speaking as a parent here, like I constantly ask myself, how are my kids really, and do I really know? And it's the hardest question to answer. And I think I have a pretty good pulse, because I'm reading body language, and I'm reading every sign I can. But for me, that's like one thing that I want to be sure. Well, I want to be as sure as I can that I've got a good pulse on that. Is that something you think? Have you guys? Is that something you are already seeking to help parents with, or that you plan to?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We have modules within the app that are about, again, it's not that we're trying to turn every parent into a psychologist, but it is this notion that all of those tools and techniques that sit in their practice rooms, um, some of them you can use in the same way that, as people, we're familiar with first aid kits, and we technology has made it easier and easier to understand any aspect, any physical or biological aspect of the body. So we think a lot of that can be put into the arms of and the hands of parents. I think part of it is around absolutely, tools and techniques to try and help you read a child. Um, Tools and techniques, and this is where it does sound really odd and somewhat counterintuitive, because we have this saying of like, no one knows your children as well as you do. And of course, that is a pretty fundamental truth. But how well do you really know them? And that's about learning how to, this is the odd sounding thing, learning how to talk to them about this stuff. That's about trying to learn how to find the right time, the right context. We often, the therapist and the psychologist will say, don't make it confrontational. Maybe when you're on a car drive, maybe when you're having a walk by the beach, maybe when you're side to side. Times of day, for some, that 10 minutes before they go to bed, as they're getting ready and they're winding down, they're much more open with you and perhaps a bit more tactile. That bit you've got to figure out, the timing and the context bits, and we'll guide you a bit with that. But then I think tools and exercises. There's an activity that got added to the app just last week, and the ParentalEQ app is sort of free to download. There are some free modules. Is around clay therapy. So often using a third party to explain how you're feeling. We were running a webinar actually with a corporation the other week, and a parent asked the question, and this was in Sydney, where we've been in lockdown until Monday. and it was about their child using a teddy to explain their feelings. So if you weren't attuned to that, you may have missed a whole way of back to your point of understanding how your child is thinking, feeling, being. So yeah, there are absolutely, and it's tricky because on the one hand, back to building a startup, you're trying to productize it in a very bespoke way to hook into a pain point to get people to use you. So hey, dealing with anxiety, right? Here are some modules on anxiety. But really, the honest thing we're trying to do is it's a holistic tool set that what we really want is a parent to commit to 6 months, because then you'll get, you go through all the modules. You'll learn all the different tricks. But it's I suppose I keep coming back to exercise as a metaphor. Sometimes there needs to be a trigger, whether it's my New Year's resolution, my weight loss goal, or the half marathon and then as a result you get into a rhythm of doing stuff. So we're hooking you in through a pain point, and then our ambition is to create habit that gives you both a good feeling, and it gives you confidence, and it allows you to make progress with your child. Does that make sense?
It does. It really does. As you're talking, I'm getting a picture of any parent, if they really stopped and thought about it for a minute, would love to be able to say to themselves, I'm a very good parent. I'm a rock star parent. Of course, there's always something to learn, and I'll never be done with that process. But I wonder if, as you guys go forward, that your marketing message could get to the point where people start to see that if I just committed to this 6-month course, then at the end of that, I would start to feel that I'm actually a really good parent, and I would stop having so many doubts about my parenting ability, or I don't know. Something you were saying there a minute ago as well reminded me of how in my early 30s, through business, I was exposed to the concept of having coffee one-on-one with people, and it was so alien to me, and I didn't understand the value, and it just felt weird. And then I realized the value over time, and now I just see that this is one of the most, I think it is maybe the best part of my life, is one-on-one conversations with people. It's the most amazing thing. And I started realizing over time, like, families don't do this. They just kind of don't. And I never did this with anyone in my family. I never had one-on-one conversations that were specifically scheduled for that, right? For that purpose. And I didn't know how to do them. They felt awkward. And I still have challenges with my teenage kids, but I try to commit to that as much as I can. We've kind of made a bit of a ritual where we just go for coffee or whatever, we go out together. And I didn't prioritize that enough early on, I guess, but I'm starting to do it more. And anyway, just sharing. But I have a question for you, kind of related to, I've heard you talk about the term unlearn, and you've said that you think it's vitally important for early stage founders. Can you give an example of some of the ways that you've had to, and I know I'm shifting gears quite a bit here, but what have you had to unlearn, and what do you think that process looks like, and why do you think it's hard for people?
I think it's correlated with age. I think it's correlated with success and with progression. Because if you've had a history over time of things you've done that have worked for you, then it's instinct to continue to use them. Look, and I think folk with a decent EQ as well as IQ will probably naturally keep learning pieces. And what I realized, and it hit me most, I think, in doing startup, back to the point earlier around how different entrepreneurship is to entrepreneurship, for example. And there's so many things that work well in large corporations because of the context of large corporations that simply do not work. And most of it is operational. So I think one is just the seismic jump from the construct of a large company to the nature of a small group of people. And it's reminding ourselves, I think it was a quote from Steve Blank, which is, a startup is not a business. it's a set of experiments to prove a hypothesis, and when you prove the hypothesis, then you raise your Series A and operationalize it and scale, and bang, off you go. And for most people, including a lot of founders I meet, don't get that, and I have to remind myself of that. I forget all the time because I'm indoctrinated. So part of it is just things crystallizing that in an ideal world would stay plastic. A part of it is realizing that I've got this incredible experience and wisdom, and there are certain elements of it that are super powerful. And hopefully, as an older founder, I also make the metaphor, which I hope will serve me well and serve others well, around the fable of the tortoise versus the hare. Because startup, and when you go into startup accelerators, and I kind of get it, are all about you got to go fast, and investors expect you to go fast, and if you don't go fast, you'll kind of fail. And I'm thinking, well, if you're a bit older, hopefully there's a certain amount of experience that might make you not make as many of certain mistakes. And so you often, to a lot of investors, and I'm pitching a lot at the moment, we look a bit slower. And I'm hoping that there's the wisdom side, which kind of says, actually, well, we will eventually, as the tortoise, overtake the hare at a certain point. And then the other part is the unlearning part. So it is the ability, particularly for older founders, to just have the courage to go, this stuff, this bit here, will not serve me well in what I am doing today. So I am, as far as anyone is concerned, discarding, jettisoning this piece of kind of knowledge, because either from a book or more likely from my co-founders or my network, I'm being shown and I'm being coached in new things. And I'm gonna, and it feels bloody uncomfortable. I have no idea if it's going to work, but I know this isn't. So I've got to embrace that. So I think it is about letting go of things and bringing new things in, and testing them. So it's almost kind of agile iteration in yourself as well
Yeah.
as applied to the product, if that carries as
It
a metaphor.
really connects for me. I have only one tattoo. It's this open delta, which I got recently this year, which for me is a symbol of a commitment to always being open to change and never being rigid in anything I know. Anything I think I know, I'm still open to new data. And I very much believe that remaining flexible like clay instead of baked like a mug, is really vital in being able to adjust quickly to what you learn. It's like you get new data and you think, well, but if you're married to something, if you're kind of attached to something because you think you're certain that this is the right way, or you're certain things, you're much slower to adjust. And I've been really proud of our company in the last 3 years, where I think we've iterated a lot. And while we're not building a tech product as our core product, like it's more of a traditional model. It's not the kind of business where once you reach the point where you really figured it out, that you just can add money to it and explode it. It's not that model necessarily, but I think any traditional business in today's world needs to have that same kind of flexibility, because we need to solve problems in new ways. And it does take you typically 2 to 3 years to figure that out, really, if you're trying. And instead of just saying, okay, well, we can sell this thing and keep selling it that way, if you keep asking the questions and keep talking to your customers, you'll find that you can add new value to whatever it is that you're doing. And by year 2 or 3, maybe 4, you've really found that niche. You've really found that thing that people want, and you can keep going. So yeah, I think that's very valuable what you just said. And I'm hearing more and more startup founders more committed to that, and kind of seeing the startup world as being a bit broken in that way. It's like, yes, go fast to iterate and learn to get through that process to the point where you found what works. But going fast to make money, I think, is a mistake in those first couple of years. You shouldn't be thinking that way. And yeah, well said. Um, it's been a really interesting, enjoyable conversation so far. I really, I heard a lot of passion come out of you today in this conversation about what you're doing, and I think personally, I'm excited to see the future of what Parental EQ is doing and solving. I think it's one of those problems that you can't possibly measure the ripple effect impact 30, 50, 60, 70, I mean, hundreds of years from now, because we could talk about generational impact on changing childhoods, right? So I'm very much an advocate of what you're doing. Um, is there anything you want to leave people with before we wrap up? And at the end, I want you to tell people how to find you and where to start if they're interested in knowing more. But like, is there anything we haven't covered today that you think we should?
I'm sure there's lots of things, but I think the main depends on the lens, Eli. I guess there's probably a few themes around different types of founders and different types of startups, and the learning and the methodologies. I think with ParentalEQ, for parents that are out there, there's a massive opportunity for us to. We've made jokes about parenting leaderboards, and maybe in some cultures it would be a wonderful thing, and in other cultures it would be a disastrous thing. So it's not about beating the person next door to you to be a better parent. I'd probably say, it's the metaphor is probably more like climbing or mountaineering, where it's a journey that's with you, and it's about, can you be the best version of yourself, and in this context, the best version of the parent. And that's on the premise that for a chunk of your child's life, you're a really, really important role model. And I've certainly learned firsthand, probably bigger than I thought. I think for those that have been in lockdown, and even those that haven't and just have adjusted their working habits and are probably working more from home, what's been fascinating as a global experiment in the last 2 years is parents are seeing have seen more of their kids than they've ever seen before, and vice versa. I was speaking to somebody earlier today who is utterly convinced that their child's vocabulary has evolved much, much faster because they've all been at home. They've spent more time together. So look, I mean, we just put out a press release recently that certainly with older kids and in lockdown, there's definitely lots of examples of parent-child disconnect, more to do with the breaking of routines. And there's a big message from us around routine is important in everyone's lives. Again, more than we perhaps realize. But I think my point here is there's a big opportunity now that's been catalyzed by COVID for parents to kind of look a bit closer, because you can and you should. So I think I will leave it there.
I love that. I look at this pandemic as something where I believe, I hope, and I believe that 10 years from now we look back and we see some huge pivotal moments in time that have become very positive, catalysts or accelerators toward a better state of things. I think education, how many millions of parents and other people just across the planet, how many people woke up and realized how obsolete and unnecessary our education model has been, and people are like, why would I go back to that, and yeah, to your point, many more opportunities for us to engage differently now that we're changing the way we do things. So I think that's a great message. Thanks for sharing. For people who would be curious to check out what you're doing, where would they follow you? How would they find you? And how do they, where should they start?
So the complete versions of the ParentalEQ app are only available in Australia and the UK right now. But if you're not in those two countries, you want to find out more, then there's a couple of things you can do. You can find our ParentalEQ.com website and learn a bit more about us there. If you're in a particular country and you're keen to get access to the app, then you can find me via LinkedIn. Feel free to message me, and there may be ways in which we can, depending on which country you're in, give you access to the app if you want to take a look at it. I am keen Well, we're building this for parents, but another part of the journey around the go-to-market part of the journey has been the role of schools. Schools have been fascinating, talking about education and how that's evolving. I am 100% convinced now that mental health, mindfulness, emotional well-being is on its way to becoming formal curriculum in schools. Heads have verified this from around the world. And the funny thing is, again, I go back to countries that have been in lockdown. I was speaking to some headmasters and principals, headmistresses in the UK during the middle of lockdown, and they were saying, you know what, it's fascinating. We teach all of this stuff, so our teachers are well equipped. Our kids are actually pretty resilient, and being able, most of them have done okay during lockdown or better. The problem has been the parents, the disconnect, because of the generational gap, just like software, where parents of a certain age go, kids are just, very comfortable with it. It's exactly the same thing. And so I think that's fascinating. There's a whole, for certain markets, I've been given advice that, if you don't learn this stuff, it'll make you a bad parent. There's definitely, if teaching EQ is important, then parents are at risk of being the weak link in some countries and in some cultures.
Yeah, I can see that here where I am in the Philippines for sure. Vijay, thank you so much for today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to the next time we talk, and thanks for sharing your experiences and wisdom with people listening.
All the best. Look after yourselves out there. Thanks, Eli.
Thank you too.